Welcome everyone to, on the 1 year anniversary of the Race to Zero, a look at the impact of net zero. My name is Tom Hale. I'm an associate professor at the Blavatsky School of Government at the University of Oxford, and it's my pleasure to moderate this conversation with a really great panel of experts who I'll turn to shortly. Before turning to them though, just a quick word on what brings us together here in the conversation today. We are speaking 5.5 years after the Paris Agreement, and in that Paris Agreement, you will find a very precise but somewhat confusing phrase, which is to achieve a balance between sources and sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century. And many say this is the signature, or one of the real signature achievements of the Paris Agreement, this idea of achieving a balance between sources and sinks, and a concept perhaps more commonly known today as net zero. So we're looking in this session at what the impact of that decisive phrase has been since the Paris Agreement, and in the related pieces of work and research and activity we've seen unfold around it. That feels like another world ago, back in 2015, but actually given the urgency of the climate crisis, we know that every single second counts going forward. So what's happened in terms of the impact of net zero the past 5 years, 5.5 years, is part of what we're looking at today, but also trying to think about where that sets us up going forward, because we now know that even though we've seen a groundswell of climate action in the years since Paris, we need to have a lot more action to get to where we need to get to by the end of this next decade, by 2030. And so the questions we're going to be asking today are, what is the impact? What has been achieved so far? But also, what more do we need to do? As I said, we have a fantastic group of experts to talk through this, but we're going to start actually with a deep dive look at one new data point, or rather a report that collects a whole number of data points looking at what's been achieved so far. We are pleased to now launch the third global aggregation report prepared by a consortium of organizations, the New Climate Institute, the German Development Institute, the Global Center on Adaptation, the Netherlands Environment Institute, CDP, Oxford, and the Data-Driven Enviro Lab. And as the director of the Data-Driven Enviro Lab, Professor Angel Xu, which I'll turn to now to talk about this report. This report is a summary of what's been achieved in climate action over the past year, and gives us a snapshot both of the potential, but also of where we've come from, and gives us a really interesting, if you will, roadmap toward the decisive decade we're looking forward to in 2030. So to kick us off, Angel, could I turn to you first to summarize what are the key messages from the 2021 Global Aggregation Report, and where do we want to go next?
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for that really great introduction and this setting of the scene. And so I think back to the Paris Agreement, which really for the first time highlighted the contributions of subnational actors. So this would be cities, states, and regions, and also companies to implementing the Paris Agreement and to getting us to our goal of containing global temperature rise within 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so once that formal recognition was included in the Paris Agreement, then the question for the analytic community was, okay, well, what does that all mean? And what is the potential? And are all of the pledges that the subnational and non-state actors taking, is it actually additional to what national governments have pledged? Or are we simply just seeing that these actors are playing supporting roles to what national governments have put in place? And so this is where we started the series of reports called Global Climate Action from Cities, Regions, and Companies. The first report was launched in 2018 at the Global Climate Action Summit, which was hosted by former California Governor Jerry Brown and former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. And at that time, we provided the first snapshot of what is the landscape of these various actors and what is their potential in 2030 to help narrow the emissions gap. And so this report that we're launching this week is the third version, as you mentioned, of this series. And so we do several things. First is we quantify the potential. What is, if we take all of the quantifiable, and so this is a key piece, this is a key caveat, is that if we take all the quantifiable pledges that subnational actors and businesses have publicly reported, and we look at their baseline and what those pledges look like, and then in 2030, if are able to quantify and disentangle the overlaps with other actors operating on the same emissions, and then also comparing them to national governments, we're finding that that can lead to an additional 2 to 2.5 gigatons on top of current national policies. And so this is a little bit of an uptick of what we've seen in the previous two reports. And this is exciting because what it means is that actors are not backing away from what they've already pledged in the previous period leading up to 2020. And so we're seeing that more actors have pledged actually midterm targets, so 2030, 2035 targets. And so that's giving us confidence that the momentum that we saw in the previous two reports after Paris and leading up to 2020 has not gone away, and that more actors are still engaged and signing up every day and committed to implementing the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I think that that's really exciting. So that's one of the key findings. And then secondly, we also look at cooperative initiatives. So what happens when you have cities and regions and companies work together, often across national boundaries, internationally, and often with national governments. And so looking at a series of initiatives that also we can find evidence of their progress and that they've implemented their certain actions to reach their targets, that's looking like an additional 15 to 16 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent on top of what national governments have pledged in 2030. And so the world of potential, I think, looks very promising. And despite the COVID-19 pandemic, what we're seeing is that we're still seeing engagement and momentum building towards this critical target of having global emissions by 2030. So that's one of the key findings. And then secondly, and this is the new piece of the report that we haven't had in previous reports, is looking at progress. And so taking data that these various players have reported, can we actually evaluate whether or not they're on track to meeting their 2030 and 2035 midterm targets, or are they not? And so when we take a look at that picture, it's a little bit mixed. So on one hand, we're not seeing that every single actor that has pledged a target is actually reporting sufficient inventory emissions data for us to then be able to draw a line between the baseline and then the inventory to then assess, are they on track to meeting their goal? So in terms of cities, only about 20% of them are actually reporting sufficient data to track progress. And in terms of companies, it's a little bit better because we're looking at CDP data. And so about half of the 800 companies that we evaluated have that progress data. And then, so that's another key finding, is that we're still not seeing a lot of companies and subnational governments actually reporting needed data to be able to track that progress. So then the third key finding I wanted to highlight is when we take a look at that data of progress, who's actually on track? And so what we're seeing is that about half of the subnationals, so that includes both cities and regions, look like they're on track to achieve their targets. So that's pretty encouraging. Although we're still seeing in that other half, some of them are actually headed in the wrong direction and growing their emissions. So more needs to be done to try to figure out why that's happening. And then in terms of companies, we're seeing a much rosier picture. About 2/3 of companies that have reported that progress data are on track to achieve or actually even overachieve their targets. So I think that that's encouraging, but then also that could suggest that they may not be as ambitious as we would like them to be. And so if you only pledge, for example, a very modest or a very minimal target, then it's much easier to achieve than if you actually commit to a much more ambitious target. So these are the key findings that I wanted to highlight in the report, and we will be conducting more analysis on net zero targets specifically, and so that should be coming out in the coming weeks as well. So just want to encourage people to stay tuned for that analysis.
Thank you, Angela, for those key findings. So, I mean, these are some really impressively big numbers, 2 to 2.5 gigatons for the individual level commitments by cities and businesses, but 15, was it 15 to 16 gigatons for the cooperative initiatives? That's a huge chunk of the remaining emissions gap. I mean, what would that mean for global temperature rise?
So that would actually get us closer to the 2 degrees Celsius goal. And so that's really encouraging. But I mean, again, there are assumptions that are included in that really big number. So we have to assume that all of the various actors that are participating in their initiatives actually follow through and implement policies and actions to achieve those goals. And that's a huge assumption because, as I just mentioned in the second key finding, we're actually not seeing that a lot of actors are actually reporting and coming forth with that transparency and that data to be able to know, are they actually on track to achieving those really big goals? And so that's one of the points that I want to highlight as part of this discussion today. How can we actually encourage various businesses and subnational actors to follow through and actually report that really needed data so we know whether or not we can actually achieve those reductions?
Absolutely. So we have this massive potential, but then, a bit more of a sobering picture on the pathway from Paris to now. And now we know that's going to have to continue to improve if we're going to reach this really big potential we have. But the good news is that this potential, there's a big prize here to be fought for. And that's why tracking, looking at accountability, but also how we empower cities and others to be able to meet these targets is going to be so important. Fascinating results. On our next turn, if I can, to Richard Black. Richard is Senior Associate at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit and is a co-author of a recent report looking at the landscape of net zero targets, which is looking exactly, picking up from what Angel just ended on, how net zero targets specifically, not just, not the full landscape of climate targets, but specifically net zero targets are being adopted by a whole range of different actors, and also what the quality of those net zero targets looks like. Richard, can I ask you, what are we seeing in terms of the current landscape of net zero, and why has this concept become so important as an organizing principle for climate action?
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom, and thanks so much for the invitation. It's a great time to be looking at this, actually, because the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit 2 years ago to the month published what I think was the first look at the uptake of net zero targets across the world. And at that point, net zero targets covered about 16% of global GDP, and now we're up in the 60s of the percent. It depends exactly on what methods you use, but that alone tells you that the uptake in net zero targets has been absolutely amazing. And I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that net zero is now the defining way, the all-encompassing way in which a lot of entities are viewing decarbonisation and the way to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I would say that in essence, there are three ways in which net zero matters as a concept and why it's proving a little bit successful. So the first is it's mandated by science. The IPCC in 2018 was very explicit that part of the recipe, if you like, for giving us a good chance of achieving the 1.5 Celsius Paris limit is to reach net zero CO2 emissions around mid-century. The second reason is because it's actually a sensible thing. If you're a government or if you're a company or a city or whatever, you set the long-term goal and then you work out how you're going to get to it. I mean, most famously, President Kennedy didn't say, we're going to get 20% of the way to the moon and then we're going to work out how to do the next 10% and so on. No, we're going to get to the moon within a decade, and then you work out how you do it. And it's exactly the same principle if you're planning a business or if you're planning the major economic change, which of course the net zero transformation is. And I think the third reason why it is proving its success is because it is actually happening. There are many theories that you can read in academic and civil society discourse about what's needed to deliver the Paris Agreement or what's needed to stop climate change. But this one is actually happening. And that kind of counts for a lot, given the sharp timescale that we're on. But the big caveat is, of course, is that all the setting of net zero targets that we've seen from countries, from states and regions, from cities, from corporates, they actually have to be delivered. And so there is, of course, the big question about, are these entities setting net zero targets actually serious? And there is part of the civil society in particular, also part of academia, that sees that a lot of these corporations in particular are not serious and really criticizes the entire net zero concept for that reason. So earlier this year, ECRU and colleagues at Oxford, including Tom and Kate, who's also on the call, published the first look at these in a report called Taking Stock, and Kate's going to take you through some of the numbers a little bit later. But we wanted to answer this basic question: how serious are entities actually being about the net zero targets that they've pledged? So, for example, do they have interim targets? Do they have some kind of mechanism for reporting progress? We haven't yet looked at, are they linked to CEO pay? But actually, there's no reason why we shouldn't look at that, because that alone tells you whether the company is actually serious about delivering these targets. And across the spectrum, it's really a mixed bag. And I think you see some entities that clearly are very serious and others that aren't. So the big task, the big opportunity, I think, particularly en road to COP26 and then out the other side, is taking those commitments which are not firmed up and actually working with entities and putting pressure on entities to firm them up. So if you have a company that's pledged a 2050 target, but they don't have anything in between, well, how on earth do you think you're going to get there then? If they're being very, very loose with offsets, again, well, does this really stack up? Do the numbers really stack up? A key question, of course, isn't really what that looks like now, but is it changing? Is this belief, which is inherent in the net zero concept, that setting a net zero target will encourage short-term action, is that actually turning into reality? And there are some indications, I wouldn't put it stronger than that, but there are some indications that it is. We've seen just really within the last 12 months, we've seen the EU, the UK, Japan, Korea, all set net zero targets. And in the case of the EU, the UK and Japan, they've all then come back and said, well, actually, we're going to strengthen our short-term target as well, because we need to make it commensurate with the longer-term target. And I'm told that similar discussions are underway in Korea as well. So, if that's reflected in more countries, states and regions, corporates, etc., then there will be some proof out there that this is really, really the way to do things, and that net zero can succeed. The key thing really is that net zero has to succeed. We're now in a situation where the rates of decarbonisation needed to hit the 1.5 Celsius target are steep, and we need to get on with them. There are a number of entities who pledged net zero targets who seem to have forgotten about the other two parts of the IPCC's recipe for 1.5, which is halving CO2 emissions over this decade and also making sharp reductions in other greenhouse gas emissions. Those are just as serious as the net zero pledge. And so the key thing is, as I said, to make sure that the pledges that have been made are robust. That's the big opportunity before us at this moment. Tom.
Thanks, Richard. No, I think it's really fascinating how the parallel between that report that you're describing on net zero targets and the report Angel introduced around showing this massive potential, a huge chunk of the world economy now committing to net zero, but also more work needing to be done to make those commitments robust. Just as Angel said, the potential of these commitments to really bring down emissions by gigatons and gigatons by 2030, but mixed evidence to date on the progress toward them. So we're in this kind of common pattern where we're reaching toward the right ambition, but need to accelerate our efforts to really deliver on it. And I'm delighted that our next panelist is going to be able to speak to exactly some of the nit and grit about how we get there, because this is really, I think, the key question we're all grappling with. Kate Cullen is a doctoral candidate at the University of California at Berkeley, and as Richard mentioned, a co-author of the net zero report he was describing before. Kate, based on your research, how are we seeing these net zero commitments translate on the ground, and what can we learn about how to accelerate this race to zero?
Thanks, Tom. So great to be with you all here today. To add to Richard's comments, based on the research our team was doing for the Global Net Zero Stocktake report, which is dated to late 2020, as a disclaimer on these stats that we have here, we're seeing this wave of ambition to reach the Paris goal of net zero emissions well before 2050 has translated to some form of net zero commitment in 124 countries, 73 states and regions, 155 cities, and 417 companies among our sample of the world's largest entities. We're also finding these commitments cover at least 61% of global greenhouse gas emissions, 68% of global GDP in purchasing power parity terms, and 56% of the world's population. So in many ways, this is a huge and long in the making breakthrough on the ground level of global climate ambition. But as we've talked about a bit already, our research also finds there are wide discrepancies in the quality and composition of these net zero commitments across the world. So roughly 20% of existing net zero commitments we find meet the Race to Zero campaign criteria, the starting line to pledge, plan, proceed, and publish around the net zero target. And those remaining 80% of net zero commitments have their work cut out for them in various regards, to set an interim target critically, to publish a plan publicly, demonstrate progress towards those goals, today, tomorrow, every year in the next 29 years before 2050, and create a reporting mechanism. What's key to point out is across the board, we find a chronic lack of clarity around offsetting practices. We find all entities, and especially companies, need to do a better job of disclosing how and to what extent they plan to use offsets. But on that other side of the discrepancies spectrum, we're seeing best practices and innovation around net zero targets emerging. And I'll just highlight a few of those that caught our attention in our research among local governments and corporate targets specifically. So at a state level, for net zero targets, one that really stands out is the New York State target. New York State is home to 19 million people in the United States. And in 2019, they put their net zero commitment into law. And in that law, offsets are limited to 15% of economy-wide emissions reductions and can only be used when a source has reduced its emissions to the maximum extent possible. And further reductions are, quote, not technologically feasible. The bill also specifies that offsets be additional, permanent, maximize benefits to local ecosystems and public health, and not result in a disproportionate environmental burden to disadvantaged communities. So what I think is so strong about this commitment around offsetting is how intersectional with biodiversity, with equity and justice, their approach is. And in addition, this New York State law further operationalized those principles of equity and justice through clear mechanisms and significant state funding, which is rare to see in the landscape right now. They commit between 35 and 40% of all their spending on clean energy and climate. So that's in the realm of billions of dollars to benefit disadvantaged communities. And they have a climate justice working group, et cetera, et cetera. It's really quite an impressive commitment and quite a few criteria, and especially in those two key areas. So just quickly, a few more examples on the corporate side of things. We've seen that Microsoft, which committed to carbon negativity by 2030, has published extensive criteria regarding standards for carbon removal. And so they're breaking a lot of ground in that space for corporate governance of carbon removal. And there's a lot of work going on there. Maersk, which is the world's largest container ship company, issued its net zero by 2050 pledge in late 2018. And they know that there's a 20-year plus lifetime on the ships that they operate. So the first carbon-free ships will need to be in operation by 2030 by the latest for them to reach their goal. And in fact, they are 7 years ahead of schedule to reach their goal, that 2030 goal. They recently announced the first carbon neutral container vessel will be on the water by 2023. Very promising. And then around scope 3 emissions, General Motors is doing some interesting work. They've committed to net zero by 2040 and include all of scope 3 emissions, which account for 98% of their emissions. So in summary, on the ground, we're seeing broad ambition from the majority of actors. We're also seeing there's a lot of work to do to raise the robustness of commitments across geographies and sectors. And that we still need to demonstrate real tangible progress before we can say we're safely on a path towards meeting our net zero goals by 2050 at the latest. So a lot of collective work to do here, especially around the quality of targets. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate. Great examples. I think it's fascinating to see how entities like cities and businesses or investors, etc., are all trying to get not just the race to zero starting line, but then to really sprint ahead down the track and to try to really innovate and find a way forward and to do something different that hasn't been done in the past to win this race, which we all desperately need to win. Kate's examples really show the importance, I think, of leadership and of pathfinding. And one of the kind of pieces of the climate action ecosystem that really has been at the forefront of that effort is the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is one of the key platforms to which businesses are beginning to align their work to the Paris Agreement. Alberto Carrillo is the director of Science-Based Targets at CDP. And he is therefore sitting at the heart of this transformation. Alberto, the business ambition for 1.5 is the official kind of race to zero partner that's brought in more companies than any of the other partners. And it's really one of the biggest pieces of this very large ecosystem. How have you found that kind of leadership work? How getting companies to think about these things, not just in a kind of science-based way, but actually in a leadership all the way to 1.5 sort of way. I was just looking, an analysis of the first cohort of the business ambition of 1.5 companies showed that they have in total reduced their emissions by 25% since 2015. So there's a lot of progress there to build on, but obviously huge more ways to go to get to 50% by 2030, which is, we know, where we need to get globally to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. So Alberto, what do you think is really driving that change, and how can we accelerate it?
Great, thanks, and also thanks for the invitation to speak today. Well, I think there are 4 elements that, in my view, are important. The accelerated action that we're seeing with corporates. The first one is the importance of setting public and ambitious targets. All these targets that companies are setting, and they're getting scrutinized through the Science Based Targets Initiative, through Race to Zero, and through other platforms. They're public targets by nature, right? And of the fact they are public targets help to create accountability on these targets, and companies are being accountable from many fronts, including from investors, civil society, business partners, and customers. And so I think the fact that targets are public encourage companies to actually take action to meet their targets. And I think this is one of the key elements and something that we need to encourage at a wider scale. The second element is these are really, really ambitious targets. And as you said, we are seeing a race to the top. The average company that has set targets through the SBTi, for instance, has targets that exceed the rate that is needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. In average, companies are committing to reduce their direct emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2, by over 60%. And these are really, really ambitious targets, and companies have no time to waste. When they commit to such ambitious targets, they need to start reducing emissions right away. And I think that's the second reason why we're seeing short term. And as Richard mentioned, it's also the importance of having ambitious interim targets. I think the third element is climate targets make financial sense. We saw, for instance, in analysis conducted by CDP last year in Europe, that companies that reported climate targets and emission reductions in average observed benefits of around 17 euro per every ton of carbon reduced. And of course, when you are also finding a good financial case, then companies take more action to reduce emissions. And of course, it depends also having the right policy framework. And finally, beyond the financial case, it makes good business sense for companies to decarbonize. We are seeing these increasing expectations from investors, from policymakers, from customers, from society, from employees, and companies need to demonstrate that they are taking serious climate action, and they also need to demonstrate that their business model is a model that is resilient to climate change and to the low carbon transition. And so I think all of these factors are helping inform the level of ambition and action that we are seeing, which is great. I think now the challenge that we have is how do we actually create an ecosystem that can scale up this action, not to thousands of companies, but to all companies on the planet.
That's exactly a fascinating challenge to think about, Alberto. How do we scale up from, I think you've scaled up from like hundreds to thousands, and now how do we add a few more zeros to the end of that? Any thoughts? What do you think?
Well, I think we are seeing an acceleration. I think some of the policy developments that we saw in the past few months are definitely key. Some of the changes we are seeing also on the investor space are also key to accelerate. I think part of what is needed is to create additional capacity in some regions and some sectors that were lagging in this transition. And so I think we need to really invest in building that capacity, we need to connect the climate agenda with the development agenda, because we don't want to create a polarized world where some sectors and some parts of the world are digitalized and decarbonized and others are lagging behind. And so for this, it's important for us to invest and also to connect climate with development.
And I think that really resonates with the kind of scale of the transition we're looking at. I think since the Paris Agreement, this groundswell of activity we've seen has really been about mobilizing the front runners, running ahead as fast as possible, changing through leadership, changing what's the sort of terrain that lies behind, changing technology, changing business models, building up that ambition loop that you referred to, about to where action begets more action. But obviously, as we get to the full scale, we need to think about not just how fast the front runners can run, but how quickly we can also bring along everyone else in this race, because this is a race to zero for everyone. And that means that the rate limiting thing may not just be how quickly the front runners can run, but also how quickly those who are less able to run fast can be brought along with everyone else. So this is a really a new dimension, I think, to the work that we're seeing begin to emerge. Angel, can I come back to you next? We've, based on this conversation on both research around net zero targets and action, and the report that you've been working on, what do you think is going to make the biggest difference toward aligning with the 1.5 degree trajectory in this decisive decade? You've laid on the table 15 to 16 gigatons. How do we get there?
Yeah, so in addition to the points that I brought up earlier, which was about the need for transparency and accounting and reporting, when Kate was speaking, I also was thinking back to our 2 net zero reports that we launched last fall in September and October, also documenting the landscape and I think identifying a lot of the challenges that Kate identified. And so I would say that the number one thing that companies and subnationals can do is to focus as much as possible on getting their own emissions down to zero. And so these questions about the credibility of offsets and how much are different actors actually relying on offsets, what we found in those reports is that many actors currently are not actually providing information about whether or not they're relying on these offsets in order to achieve these net zero goals. And so I think that adds a whole lot of uncertainty to the credibility of net zero pledges and leaves an open question as to whether or not we can actually get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So as we know, there are a lot of issues, and you have also been involved in work on setting criteria and principles for offsetting and for net zero definitions. And I think this is really critical and really important. And so I think this next phase, we really need actors to hopefully dig into these different criteria and these guidelines and focus as much as possible on thinking, okay, well, how can I actually reduce my own scope 1 and scope 2 emissions as far as possible to zero, so that I don't have to necessarily rely on offsets and try to figure out which ones are credible, which ones are actually permanent and actually will lead to irreversible permanent removal from the atmosphere, which right now is also an uncertain domain. And there's lots of details that need to be worked out in that space. So I would say that would be the first step. And then once an actor is totally sure and have done everything that they can on their scope 1 emissions, I think a second area that is a huge opportunity is actually looking at scope 3 supply chain emissions. And so when we published those reports last September and October in 2020, we actually didn't find any subnational government, for example, that currently has articulated a net zero target that actually is focused on scope 3 emissions. And very, very few actors have actually even accounted for and reported for their scope 3 supply chain based emissions. And so I think that this is another area that if we want to be really credible for 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to provide a lot more data, a lot more attention and details on what those emissions look like. And so to me, if only focusing on the scope 1 and scope 2, that's doing a lot. But then if the bulk of your emissions and carbon footprint is focused on scope 3 and you have no idea what those emissions look like, I kind of feel like it's just kind of shifting between buckets, right? And so That's, I think, one of the greatest challenges with respect to net zero and 1.5 is that we live in this very interconnected society where I think some people on one end of the extreme would say, well, net zero is a totally elusive concept. It can't happen unless the entire economy is decarbonized, which I think we're not there yet. And so, yeah, so to me, it would be focusing on getting those own emissions, scope 1 and 2, down as far as possible to zero. And then secondly, looking into the scope 3 opportunity.
Thanks, Angela. I think you're really hitting the nail on the head with the idea of figuring out how we wrap our collective hands around this very, very difficult problem, because we know we need to get to global net zero by 2050 to keep 1.5 within reach. And each entity, city, business, et cetera, has sort of continuing to play in that process. And so an individual net zero target needs to be linked up to a system that's allowing the whole world to get to net zero. And that's, I think, part of this really interesting ecosystem where all these different initiatives fit together in complex ways. And I think, Race to Zero, my own view is that the Race to Zero campaign, which we're celebrating the 1-year anniversary of today, has been a helpful umbrella for bringing that community together, defining the frontier and helping us move together. But again, we know we have more work to do to figure out how all these interlocking pieces fit together. Richard, can I turn to you next and ask, what is this sort of, we've been talking this whole panel about the kind of closing not the emissions gap, but sort of the gap between our potential and our results. And we need to get the results up to where the potential is. So if we look at that challenge, what concrete actions should cities and businesses be taking to ensure that the commitments they're making are being matched with tangible, meaningful changes in reality, and the thing that the atmosphere actually cares about?
I think you're right, Tom, and I really enjoyed Angel talking about clarity there. I think the clarity that Angel brought to the lack of clarity issue there was is great. I'd like to answer the question in a slightly different way, if I may, Tom, by not talking about the entities themselves, but about other parts of the ecosystem, people outside the entities, because I think there are 4 parts of society that have an absolutely key role to play. The first is shareholders and customers for companies, and citizens for everyone else. Because I think that these are the interested parties. These are the parties that have the power to make the entities do better. And so basically, are they demanding clarity? They need to be demanding the clarity. They need to be demanding that the targets and the plans are actually commensurate with the challenge. We haven't really talked about equity, but there also ought to be an equity component in there. And then the third thing about, are they convincing? Do you actually believe, have you seen enough to believe that the city or company or whatever is actually going to deliver net zero? So that's one key part of the system, if you like, the interested parties. Another key element is academics. We need the research to keep coming through on the scope for offsets, different ideas about what the constraints are, for example. Indeed, the science of accounting for greenhouse gas emissions itself has evolved massively over the next 10 years. We need to keep that coming. Civil society, I would say, keep us honest, guys. There's a big tent here, and inside a big tent, people can get comfortable. So keep asking the difficult questions. Make sure people don't get comfortable. Keep challenging. In particular, keep challenging businesses on scope 3 emissions, because at a certain point in the future, I don't think it's going to be credible for a business to be saying, we've got scope 1 and 2 covered, but we haven't got scope 3. I mean, if a tobacco company said, for example, we've got a great healthcare policy for our employees, that probably wouldn't convince you that they're really interested in people's health. So the similar kind of thing is going to happen, I think, with greenhouse gases. And the fourth is business itself. There is this divide, as Kate laid out really well, between some entities that have got stuff sorted, they've got their plans, they've got their interim targets, governance mechanisms, and others that don't. At some point, there's a danger that all businesses get tarred with the same brush. So if the constructive ones, the ones that are doing good stuff, call out the greenwash, this can only help.
An important role for all of us then to play in the Race to Zero. No matter what your size your emissions are, you have something you can do. Really useful thoughts, Richard. Kate, what should we be doing? What's the way to close the gap between where we need to get to and what we're doing now?
Yeah, just jumping off of these points, especially around the importance of clarity, I would even move to say we need radical transparency. We need our different entities to be able to articulate, I really don't know how to do this aspect, or I don't know how to address scope 3 emissions in my specific sector. I don't know how to identify high quality offsets. And that's really hard to do. It's hard to say, hey, at my company, we're working really hard, but we don't know, we don't have the expertise in-house to do this. And one aspect of the Global Compact 10 principles for corporate governance that always catches my eye is exactly this point around transparency and complete information. The principles talk about the need for businesses to take a precautionary approach, and through doing that on climate and environmental issues, communicate those potential risks for the consumers, for shareholders, for citizens, and provide complete information so that we're all informed about what we know and what we don't know, and that can only lend more credibility to net zero targets in general, and it can also help us be more collaborative together to fill in those gaps, to develop best practices in the next 9 years before 2030, and especially around those really sticky issues about how to operationalize ideas of equity from the level of setting an interim target in light of historic responsibility and current capacity, to ensuring a just transition, to realizing a world that is more equitable and just than the one that we currently have. So on all these levels of all these sticky issues, that radical transparency is something that will really propel us forward.
Really great call for radical transparency, radical collaboration maybe as well, to figure out how we all work together to solve those tricky problems you mentioned, Kate. Alberto, your thoughts as well on this, please. You must encounter this question a lot, where a company comes to join science-based targets, or it comes to join business ambition for 1.5. It says we can do X, and you look at it and say, actually, science says you need to do 2X. The company must get a bit of a shock then. What do you say to help them overcome this gap?
Well, I think the clarity that comes from science and from using science as a benchmark is key. And I think that's the beauty, for instance, of the concept of net zero, right? I think net zero as a concept helps us understand that any carbon released into the atmosphere is actually socially unacceptable, right? And we all understand that we need to transition towards an economy that actually doesn't cause the release of greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. And because of that, there's a transition period for companies and for the whole economy. But the reality is releasing carbon into the economy is going to become socially unacceptable, right? And I think that clarity is something that all stakeholders need to understand. Companies, investors, citizens, politicians, etc. And that means that there's no really good enough until you reach a state where your business model doesn't cause the release of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, right? I think that clarity is key, and that helps companies understand how to shape their business models, and also how to shape their supply chain, the materials that they use in their products, the products they put in the market, etc.
I think that clarity is indeed exactly what's needed, and I want to thank all four of you for the clarity you brought to this question of what is the impact of net zero during our conversation today. Just to sum up, I think we've heard really three things. We've heard there's been a dramatic increase in ambition, that we now have thousands of actors, cities, businesses, investors, civil society, et cetera, all committed to not just net zero by 2050, but to ambitious goals by 2030 that could, if they're delivered, really go a huge way to closing this gap. This is exciting because we know that what we need to do. We've also heard that we're beginning to deliver some results on those questions, but we need to do a lot more, that the amount of information we have about delivery needs to be increased, and some entities are going above and beyond, others are lagging behind, and that's going to help us pinpoint where we need to work to ensure that everyone is not just crossing the starting line in the race to zero, but actually running ahead and keeping pace and getting us all to where we need to get to. I think the third thing we've heard is that more is needed, because we know we don't yet have all of the world setting net zero targets. We don't yet have all the world setting robust net zero targets. We don't yet have all of the world delivering on robust net zero targets. And that third piece, delivery, is, I think, the message that I'm going to take away. as we look forward to the next year of Race to Zero. So just to wrap up, I wanted to ask you all for one final thought experiment. Imagine you've invented a carbon neutral time machine, and you're able to go forward throughout this decisive decade to the year 2030 and see what's been achieved by that point. And then you can make some observations, take some pictures, do some analyses, and come back to this moment in 2021 and tell us what the secret is for getting it right. What would be the most important message you as a time traveler could give to those running the Race to Zero today as they are beginning this journey? I wonder, Richard, if you might start us out with your time traveling message.
Thank you. Yes, I've parked my machine outside, but it's cooling down. I've always liked the sports imagery of the Race to Zero. In most sports, you want to strike early. You want to score a goal early. Rugby, you want to score a try early. In a sprint, you want to get off the line early and have the best start you can. And looking back from 10 years out, I think we will see that the companies, the cities, the countries that actually got on with it are the ones that have fared best. And perhaps some of the familiar names around us, the biggest entities that we see around in the world right now, won't be there in 10 years' time. They won't be in that leadership position unless they do get on with it.
Go fast, go hard, I think is a very good message for anyone running a race. Angel, what did time traveling reveal to you?
So this might be antithetical considering this is the Race to Zero, but if I were to time travel and then look back, I probably would have said everybody who decided not to compete against each other, but instead work together, radically collaborate, were able to reach the finish line together rather than every person for themselves. So I don't know if you have a quippy way to sum that up. I like the go fast and go hard, but maybe don't go alone, but go together. Something like that.
I think you made the point really well, Angel, in your comments. This is like a society-wide, all society kind of goal, and like we're running this race. We're all actually tied to each other, like a three-legged race times 7 billion people on the planet. So we're kind of stuck with each other.
Yeah, exactly. I like the three-legged race
really, yeah, a really interesting kind of race. Kate, can I ask you, what did time traveling reveal?
I think Richard and Angel really hit the nail on the head. And I might just add that, we have more in our reserves, from our training for this race than we think we have. And we can go, in addition to collaboration and transparency at these radical levels, we can go faster to get off those blocks than we thought was possible. And the more that we do in the next 9 years, the more we have that gift for ourselves after that. And so, yeah, moving as quickly as possible and not being afraid that we won't have anything left in those last reserves, I think is what I would add.
Thanks, Kate. I think it really makes perfect sense. We've gotten so many things where in the climate realm, we find a bit frustrating, lack of sufficient progress, et cetera. But think about all the things that we've done already, which have seemed impossible 5 years ago. That's a source of inspiration and maybe a model for how we accelerate even faster. Last but by no means least, Alberto, time travel revealed what secret to you?
Thanks. Well, it's difficult with all the good suggestions that came already from previous panelists, but I think I really like what Kate said. I think we're gonna realize that it was much easier than what we thought it was, and that the challenge was just to get started. We have seen that with so many other aspects in our economy. We're seeing that renewable energy, and the challenge is just to take the first step. I'm sure in 10 years from now, we're going to be celebrating that we have achieved something that we cannot even imagine today. So the challenge is just to get started.
I love this idea. The race has like a steep hill at the beginning, but then it's like all downhill from there. This is the idea of transformative S curves or other things we often talk about. So this is would be good news indeed. Thank you all for your thoughts and insights. This has really been a very clarifying session on the impact of net zero, the potential, and also the work to be done going forward. So thank you again, and look forward to seeing all of you and all of you listening in the future along the racetrack as we accelerate through this decisive decade. Thank you all.